Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this program, which is designed to give all of us a little more insight into what goes on in and around our state capital here in Salem. Our guests today are two gentlemen who've been heavily involved in the legislative process from two perspectives. We have State Senator Gene Derfler from Salem, who has been in the legislature since he was first elected in 1988. And we have Chris Davie, who is a government affairs representative for SAFE Corporation. And we'll learn a little bit more about both of these gentlemen as we interview them on the program today. But first of all, I'd just like to welcome you to Capital Insight.
Thank you for having us, Kevin.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here. Gene, I've had you on the show before, and we've talked a little bit about your background, but there are some folks who may not have heard from you before, and you might give us a little sketch of your background, going back to your work.
Well, I have been in Salem since 1952, and I used to have a business in Salem called Nyco Furniture and Appliance, which we had for some 30 years, which we've been active in. And since selling that business, I had come in the legislature, and as you know, you and I came in together in 1988. We ran together and have served the same length of time, although I've gone on to the Senate rather than sitting in the House this time.
So you are now in your first term as a senator.
First term as a senator.
And you will get a bye in 1996. Since you're a senator, you only have to run every 4 years.
Every 4 years, and that's probably the only advantage of being in the Senate is you do get a 4-year term rather than a 2-year term. So that is an advantage, so I appreciate that.
Well, Chris, and by the way, if you ever talk to me on this show, you get to call me Kevin, since I get to call you Chris. I mean, as a lobbyist, you're often referring to representatives as Representative Mannix or Senator Derfler. There's just all this protocol at the Capitol. But Chris, you've been with SAFE Corporation for a number of years, and I really don't know how long, but tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from and where you went to school.
Okay, Kevin. Yeah, I'm from England originally. I went to school in England, came to this country in 1973, and I've been with SAFE now for a little over 20 years and done a variety of things since I've been there. I started working in the underwriting department and then had a variety of jobs in the claims department. And then for the last 5 years, I've been in my present position, and that means that I've spent 3 legislative sessions now representing SAFE at the Capitol. This most recent session, of course, was the shortest, and during that 3-session period, but it was probably one of the most intense because some of the workers' compensation activity at that session.
Well, SAFE is a public corporation now and has been for many years, which means it's still something of a state entity, but is run basically, for all intents and purposes, in terms of insurance coverage, like a private insurance company. In terms of your work with the legislature, as a lobbyist, in effect, have you had an opportunity to develop some perspective about what it is you're supposed to be doing when you're dealing with all these legislators on issues?
Well, I think there's a variety of things, really. As a representative of SAFE and as someone who's spent a lot of time working with the workers' compensation system, I think I can bring the technical expertise of SAFE to the Capitol and help legislators to understand how the workers' compensation system works. I've found that legislators generally consider workers' compensation to be a fairly complex thing that maybe if they can avoid getting into it too deeply, they're pleased to not have to study all the intricacies of the workers' compensation system. So I think that I can help them to understand that. Certainly as legislators have ideas for making changes in the system, we're able to use our resources to help tell the legislators what the result would be if they were to do a certain thing. We've also helped to draft actual legislation as well. So I like to think of myself as a resource, but then also as an advocate too for some of the things that we think are important when it comes time to make changes to the system.
Well, one of the big changes that came about this past session was Senate Bill 369, which is the Workers' Compensation Reform Bill that Senator Derfler and I and Representative John Watt were co-chief sponsors on that bill. And perhaps that's an example of legislators working with citizen groups and with citizens as well as lobbyists to bring about change. Gene, you were the driving force behind Senate Bill 369, and perhaps you could discuss a little bit how you see how the forces come together when you're working on something, as opposed to an agency bill that some government agency comes in with.
Well, I think if, again, most of us recognize that we did make some major changes in 1990 in the workers' comp programs, and we found that over the 4 years that change was made, that there was some deterioration through some of the court cases that perhaps took away some of the benefits that we thought we had gained in 1990. And as you know, what we did, we sat down together and we started last fall, as a matter of fact, taking a look at the concerns that people had. And as you recall, we listened to all sides. We listened to labor, we listened to management, we listened to the insurance companies who were providing those services, trying to determine how we could make it a better system. And as you know, it is a complicated system. I think someone described it as a tree that was planted in 1913 has never been pruned. And I think that's probably a good explanation of what the bill is like, because the workers' comp was started in 1913. And as you know, we had to review it and make some changes. And we rewrote it many times. And during that process, we did involve Chris and some of the other insurance companies to help us understand the changes that we wanted to make and what would happen when those changes were made.
Well, Chris, from your perspective and your participation, and I would like to acknowledge that you were heavily involved at the outset, providing that technical expertise and the insight that SAFE Corporation can provide. And there were other insurance and business representatives heavily involved in the process. I don't want to exclude anybody, but from your perspective, as you got involved in this, how did you see your role in providing information and leading up to the creation of a reform bill that was being put together by individual legislators?
Well, I think that during the last couple of years, we at SAFE have had the same concerns as you and Senator Derfler have had about the deterioration in the case law since Senate Bill 1197. And we had made lists of the things that we thought needed to be changed. And so as the two of you were starting to get together, we also had our list of suggested changes to the system. I think we also need to talk about the Management Labor Advisory Committee. That's a group of management and labor representatives that were put together to advise the legislature and state government about how changes should be made to that group, how changes should be made to that system. And that group of people also had some ideas about changes. Unfortunately, the dynamics of the group were such that they couldn't really come to a package of reforms, but they nonetheless had some good ideas that were incorporated in the bill that you put together. So we were very keen to have the same kind of changes made that you were, and I think as from your perspective as legislators, our perspective as an insurance company, management perspective, and some labor representatives too, I think a lot of people had some input. A large number of people had input, and I think we got a better product because of that.
Well, as we look at this process, I guess it's important to talk about the role of the lobbyist and how legislators approach that. And sometimes the public has a perception of the lobbyist as being some sharp-eyed character out there in the lobby, in the dark corners of the lobby, pulling legislators aside and just feeding them little bits and pieces of information, which I think is an inaccurate perception of 99% of the lobbyists in this process, especially in Oregon. I can't speak to other states. But in this process, we had lobbyists, not just from SAFE Corporation, but from the private industry sector, from the insurance sector, from the labor sector, who would come in with their perspectives. And my reaction, and I'd like to see what you think about this, Gene, is that it's very important for those folks to first have a sense of equanimity in terms of dealing with legislators, whether they had supported them or not politically, that they're now in office, they need to be dealt with, and that there's a sense of integrity and honesty in this process, that while someone may be an advocate for a position, they're also supposed to be presenting information in a legitimate fashion, that is not holding back significant information, but saying, here it all is, and this is how we interpret it. It seemed to me that this was a process where the lobbyists were very effective, but then the publicists on the outside were another story, which I think we should talk about in a moment. But from the lobbying perspective, Gene, what was your reaction to how we worked on this legislation?
Well, I think you're right, Kevin. You know, legislators are not special people. We're just ordinary people that get elected, and we're down there. We don't really understand all of the issues. It's impossible to understand all the issues, and you can, through the legislative process, perhaps become more of an expert in some areas than others, but you can't become an expert in all of them. And what the lobbyists do, of course, they are experts in that one field. And since we have to be involved in many different fields, we'd have to depend on people who are experts in those areas to educate us and help us understand what the effect of the changes are going to be. So the lobbyists play a very, very important role in our lives. Certainly I depend on them a great deal to get information, as do you, and I think all legislators, because we don't understand all of the issues, and we have to become educated, and those are the kind of people that help us understand the issues.
Chris, from your perspective, do you see yourself as being someone who simply provides information, or do you also see yourself as an advocate? And how do you feel about your role?
I think it's a dual role. Perhaps I should make the distinction between different kinds of lobbyists too. I am an employee of SAFE Corporation, as I have said, for a number of years. And I see myself as an insurance company employee first and a lobbyist second. I'm not a professional lobbyist. Now, there are professional lobbyists at the Capitol who represent a number of different interests.
And they contract out for their services
That's
with
right.
various clients. You are an employee for a given company who, during session, is there to advocate or present information.
That's correct, yes. And as I've said, I think it is part of my role to provide information and to be a resource to legislators on these complex issues, but also to advocate what we think is appropriate public policy. SAFE, after all, is a public corporation, and we probably have a larger pool of expertise within our organization than anybody else in this subject in the state, perhaps with the exception of the Workers' Compensation Division. And so we believe that it's part of our role to suggest changes that will be positive for the whole state. And then, of course, legislators have the responsibility to make those kind of public policy decisions. So we can present alternatives, we can present ideas about how you get to a certain point, but we also suggest that there are changes that should be made that would be positive for everyone.
Let me be a bit of a devil's advocate for a moment and mention that in terms of the publicity on Senate Bill 369, the Workers' Comp Reform Bill, if I just read the papers and watched the TV, I would think that that injured workers are now getting the shaft in Oregon. That is, that somehow some serious negative legislation just passed so that people with injuries or occupational diseases are not going to get benefits anymore, and that they've just been cut off, and that just a bunch of small-minded legislators somehow managed to push all this stuff through. Now, I may be overstating it a little bit, but when I picked up on the publicity from those who oppose Senate Bill 369, I seem to get this drift. I'm curious about your reaction to this kind of publicity.
Well, I don't think that's not the truth, and you know that, Kevin. I think what we did in working with the program is we took a look at some of the deficiencies that it had, and we tried to correct those. And I think those changes needed to be made. And as we wrote the bill, we took into consideration everyone's point of view, and we tried to come up with what I think was a very fair bill. And I think we did. I think actually the changes that were made this past time are really not going to reduce the cost of workers' compensation. As you know, we increased the benefits a lot for people who are injured on the job, and that was a real benefit for those people. And I think we corrected some of the things that we felt the court had misinterpreted what we wanted. So based on that, I think that we made corrections in the bill. We didn't make dramatic changes. I think the people who are injured on the job still are going to get even more benefits than they had before. As you recall back in 1990 when we passed the original bill, we were 6th in the nation in our cost, and we were 47th in the benefit package. What we passed this last time is going to make us about 32nd in costs, and we're going to be about the same, maybe even better in benefit package. So we've brought the benefit packages up a great deal. We're going to be at the average nationally now on benefit package. So the person that's injured on the job is going to get a lot better treatment than he had in the past. So from that standpoint, we made a big improvement in the program.
I'm going to pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capitol Insight. I'm your host, Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and our guests today are Senator Gene Derfler, also from Salem, and Chris Davie, who is the public affairs official with SAFE Corporation, who handles the lobbying during the legislative session for SAFE Corporation. If you ever have any questions or concerns, I welcome those, and I'd ask you to write to me at Capitol Insight, H. 395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon 97310. We're always happy to hear from you. Picking up on this, we were talking about the publicity or whatever you might pick up in the media. And Chris, I was going to invite your comments too. It seems to me that you must be somewhere out there with a tell of the Hun, having subscribed to these workers' compensation reforms that are going to undercut injured workers throughout the state, to hear what some of the media were saying. What is your reaction to that?
Well, excuse me, I think what we wanted coming into this was a balanced package. We were concerned about the case law deterioration and the fact that that was going to have an adverse impact on rates for employers. But we were also concerned about the benefit side. And if the legislature had not taken any action during this most recent session, benefits would actually have been reduced for permanent disability at the end of this year, and they would have gone down by something like 25%. So we felt that what the legislature had to do was to create some balance, increase the benefits, but take care of the case law too. And then as we went through the process, we also found that there were a lot of other things that we could do to improve the efficiency of the system administratively, and cut out some of these strange quirks that have been in the law for many years and nobody could really understand why. So I think it depends on the perspective of the person that's looking at the changes that were made. On the management side, I have heard that this bill was too generous to workers, and that in fact it was a giveaway program and it was going to raise costs, and it probably shouldn't go through because of that reason. So maybe that's the sign of a good bill, when you've got both sides saying that they have concerns about it, then maybe it struck the right kind of balance. Well, actually, one thing I would also add, this morning I heard that on Monday we had a number of phone calls in our office from people who were for the first time getting an increased check because of the bill. One of the provisions of the bill took care of a number of surviving spouses whose spouses had been killed in an on-the-job accident, and if that accident happened before 1985, the benefit level for those spouses was lower than spouses with an accident after that date. And when the bill was signed by the governor on June 7th, it immediately increased that benefit. And so the checks that we sent out on the 1st of July included that new additional amount, and we had a lot of calls on Monday from those spouses saying, I got more money, this is good, why? And so we were able to explain that it was part of Senate Bill 369.
Kevin, I think you're an advocate for that. You've been trying to get that part of the bill passed for the last 3 sessions, as I recall, so that was something that you need to take credit for, of increasing those benefits. I think that's
I feel
great.
good about that. Maybe I should have sent letters to all those
Yes.
widows and widowers saying, congratulations, you're going to get a benefit increase. I do believe in that, and I think that that's probably what's been lost here. I didn't see headlines saying legislature approves 12% increase in permanent disability benefits. Legislature intervenes to stop 25% drop and lead to 12% increase.
Actually, I think it's a 25% increase too.
Oh, okay.
So it's even better.
And so when you put it all together, it's a lot has to do with spin, and I think that some of our I say our friends because I work with them on other issues. Some of our friends out there in labor decided to lie low on this issue and decided to be critical. And yet I think the governor worked with us in a very positive way to bring everyone together to come up with something that he could sign as a supposed liberal Democrat who could say this is a good thing for the system. And I think he had a lot of input with that from his own department, finally saying, you know, Governor, this isn't a bad bill. There's really good stuff in here for everybody. But my question for you is, if someone's got an injury on the job, say they fall off a ladder, is there any real change other than an increase in benefits? Or are we saying that the person who's on the edge of the system, the margin of the system, is the one who needs to be watching out? And I guess I'm advocating a little here when I ask this question, but I've always said that workers' compensation is not a substitute welfare system. It's a workers' compensation system. If you're injured on the job or you have an occupational disease, and we ought to be focusing on those folks and not the folks on the edge who don't have health insurance and suddenly want someone else to cover it. But what's your reaction to that, Gene?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I think that we did increase the benefits for those who have on-the-job injuries. If someone does have an existing problem, a disease or degeneration, and they go to work for someone, that employer really shouldn't be responsible for that pre-existing condition, but they should be responsible for any injury that takes place on the job. And for that reason, I think that is an improvement. We have eliminated some of the people that are on the fringes, perhaps, that really are not the responsibility of the employer. And I think that's a fair way of handling it. I think the employer should pay for his items that he's responsible for, but not more than. And that's, again, that's what we're trying to attempt to do in that particular bill.
What's your reaction, Chris?
It is a very expensive system, even with the changes that we've made over the last few years. I think that today we pay, or employers pay, premiums of around $750 or $800 million per year. And if you divide that by the number of people in the state, it's something like $250 per year for every man, woman, and child in the state is paid for the cost of workers' compensation insurance. And so I think we have a responsibility to make sure that that money is spent appropriately. And you gave the example of somebody falling off a ladder and what will happen to them today after Senate Bill 369. I don't think that anything different will happen to that worker. I think we've got some efficiencies in the system that will help that worker in some ways. And certainly if there is a permanent disability benefit, then they will be getting a substantial increase in that award. But those kinds of workers are not the ones that are going to be impacted by the bill. We think that we need to make sure that we get the right people into the system up front, the ones that should be compensated by workers' compensation insurance and not by health insurance if it's an off-the-job injury, for example. And then once they're in the system, another thing that I think Senate Bill 369 accomplishes is identifying the point where treatment for that worker is no longer work-related. They may have other things going on, and maybe there comes a point where health insurance or some other kind of insurance should pick that up. And I think we've been able to delineate that a little better through Senate Bill 369. So that will help the growth of cost in years to come.
Well, as we talk about this system and workers' compensation, which again, to many folks may seem like a very ethereal thing, but it ought to be of concern to working folks. What happens when I have an injury on the job? And the short answer is what you should do is make sure your employer knows about it, make sure you file a claim, and you will get benefits if it's an injury on the job. That has never been really the issue. The issue has been someone who over many years develops a problem and then thinks maybe it's work-related and wants to litigate that issue. What kind of standard do you use? And we've said the major contributing cause is the standard for work relationship. But better yet, if we went back to talking about the fellow on the ladder, someone falls off a ladder, that's one thing. What if somebody, on the other hand, gets high on amphetamines and shows up for work in violation of company policy, obviously, in violation of the law, and drives a forklift off the end of the loading dock? Now, under the old law, it's very hard to say, well, the reason you did that was because you were high on drugs. And we've said that kind of injury, if it was induced by someone voluntarily taking illegal drugs, is going to be, it's easier for the employer to say, wait a minute, you know, you weren't supposed to do this. Isn't this an equity and balancing process we're going through where we say, well, how much of this is covered by employment and how much is individual responsibility? What's your reaction on that, Chris? Well,
one thing that Senate Bill 369 did was to change the standard of proof where drug and alcohol consumption is involved in a claim. And it's still the insurer's responsibility to prove that there was drugs or alcohol involved. But now that has to be shown by a preponderance of the evidence rather than clear and convincing evidence, which just means that it's, I think 51% of the evidence needs to show that. But it's, you still have to show that the drugs or alcohol were the major contributing cause of the condition. So it's not going to be easy to deny claims on that basis, but a little easier than it was in the past.
Do you have any further comment on that aspect?
Well, I think Chris is right. I think that in most cases the benefit of the doubt goes to the worker, and it should. I mean, I think that it is a no-fault system, and therefore regardless of who's at fault, usually the employer pays or the insurance company pays. But I think people have to understand that when the employer pays, those dollars are taken out of the system that could be used for pay increases or for expansion of jobs, so that those costs are paid for by the public eventually. So,
and well, they're paid for by people who won't get jobs later on, because one of the big challenges in our system was that small employers found workers' comp to be a prohibitive expense, and big employers began to look to other states as places to expand their operations for fear of the workers' comp expense factor. Couldn't we call this a bit of an economic development tool, that is, to make sure the system is fair and more impartial, so that employers and managers feel like they're getting a fair shake in the system, but that also shakes out some more dollars that, instead of being used to pay workers' comp premiums and pay out benefits for questionable claims, those dollars are used to hire more workers, create more jobs in the state? You seem to be suggesting that, Gene.
Well, I think that's true. You know, when jobs are created out of the profits of business, and the purpose of a business is, of course, to make a profit, but those profits that are generated are used to either increase benefits to the people that are working, or they're used to increase jobs. And as you know, as we grow and we have more kids graduating from schools, there has to be jobs for those people to take if they're going to make a living. So, and those have to be generated out of the profits of business. And when you use those dollars to pay for, as an example, workers' comp, then it eliminates the ability to create those jobs or create pay increases.
If we didn't have the idea of loss of business and therefore loss of insurance, I would almost think that insurance companies say, hey, we don't care. You know, you want to have a lousy system that costs a lot, the insurance companies get to charge premiums. Now, eventually, that cash cow is going to die because it's going to be dehydrated. I mean, if it was purely out of self-interest, I would think that Safe Corporation would say, don't bother reforming the system, other than understanding it in a global sense that it hurts all of us. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that's true, and historically, traditional insurance companies have not been too concerned about how much the cost went up because it was easy to pass it along to the employer. I've seen that over the years in trying to address fraud situations, that it was very hard to get the large insurance establishment to recognize there's a problem with fraud because they simply increase the premiums. But we certainly feel like we have a responsibility to make sure we have a healthy economy too. And the economy of the state is changing. We're getting a lot of high-tech business coming to the state, and SAFE does a lot of work with the Oregon Economic Development Department as they go out and try to attract new business to the state. And we know that when out-of-state companies, out-of-country, foreign companies are looking at Oregon workers' compensation insurance cost is one of the things that they look at, and the benefit structure too. They're looking for a fair system for their employees, but they're also looking to control their costs.
Kevin, I think one thing we hadn't addressed, and that's if the ideal of workers' compensation, you wouldn't have accidents. And accident prevention has been an area that I think has been improved a great deal. There's a lot fewer accidents because people are aware of it. I think employers recognize the cost of having injured workers, and I think that's been one of the real benefits that we gained from 1197, from the bill we passed in 1990.
All right, and in fact, that seems to be the one thing that we overlook, as you say, because last year, in 1994 in Oregon, we had less industrial deaths than any time since reporting began, going back some 50-odd years, as I recall. Am I reading that right, Chris?
Certainly in recent years, yes. And there's an element in Senate Bill 369 that will help that too. One of the things the bill does is to expand the use of the Reemployment Assistance Reserve. That's a fund that the Workers' Compensation Division administers to help people get back to work if they're injured. And the legislature during this session changed the way that money is allocated, and now, starting in 1996, some of that money can be used for injury prevention. So I think employers will be able to use that resource to improve the safety of their work sites, and that will help to reduce injuries in years to come too.
Well, I guess it'd be interesting to look back 2 years from now and look back to 1995 and the issues and see where we go from there, because I remember in 1990 everybody was saying those reforms were terrible and injured workers were going to be undercut, but we didn't see that. In fact, we've seen injured workers pretty well taken care of.
Kevin, the same people that were complaining about the bill we passed in 1990 were complaining about the one we passed in 95. So we'll have to, like you say, 2 years from now, look back and see who was correct in that area.
Well, we've got about 1 minute left, and I'm curious as to your prognostications as to any hot issues in the comp field in the next year, or do you think things will be pretty quiet? Chris?
Well, I hope it'll be pretty quiet for certainly the next year, because the new law has to be implemented fully, and there won't be a lot of changes in case law because the courts it takes a little while for those cases to get to the courts. But I think we have to keep our fingers crossed that the courts don't try to, or don't erode Senate Bill 369 in the way that they started to eat away at the reforms from 1990.
Gene?
I would agree with that, Kevin. I think we had probably the two best technicians in the state of Oregon help write the bill, and that was yourself and Jerry Keene. And with the words that were used in writing that bill, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult for the courts to erode the system as it has in the past. So,
well, we'll have to wait and see whether or not we've put together a smooth-running Mercedes that just comes down that highway, takes care of its passengers, and doesn't run anybody down in the process. I don't know where I came up with that analogy, but I'd like to thank you both for being with us today, and I'd like to thank our audience for joining us on Capital Insight. We hope to see you again next time.